Okay, so I think I'm going to get started today, right now. So yeah, today we're going over sociology from the macro and micro lens perspective and also going through demographics. And I'm Jenelle, I'm one of the MCAT tutors here at Socratic Med. So this slide is just a reminder for anyone who this might be their first time attending one of our sessions. This video or this lecture will be posted up onto YouTube afterwards. So we just wanted to remind you that at this time would be the best to, change your name to your initials or, change your profile pictures or take it down. Just as long as you're comfortable with whatever Zoom profile you have currently in the event that it does show up on the YouTube recording. So yes, please do that now if you can. And so if this is your first time, we are in a 15-week full MCAT course, which started on June 17th. So just a quick run through. Thursday through Saturday, we have 3 lectures per week. And on Sundays, we have 1 office hour session per week. All of these are at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we aim to cover most of the highest yield MCAT content throughout this program. I also have here the GroupMe link, which is great for any updates or changes to our current course. It's also a great way to contact all the MCAT tutors that are helping out and contacting and communicating with other students too. We also have the YouTube channel here, which is where all of the recordings from these lectures will be uploaded after it is presented. So if you ever want to look at any of the past lectures we've done, head over to that channel and you can check them out. So at this time, if everyone could just make sure their mics are muted, and I'm going to get started with our lesson. We also have Mark here, who's another MCAT tutor, and he will help answer any questions in the chat. So at this time during the presentation, if you have any questions before I get to like a question in the presentation, put it in the chat if you can, and Mark will get, either Mark or me will get to it either throughout the lecture itself or once we reach one of those problem sections, I can address any of those questions that you might have. So our main learning objectives today are to review the main theories that are used to analyze society by a macrosociology lens, also to review main theories to analyze society by a microsociology lens, and to review the different demographics that are used to separate groups within a population, and to finally review the demographic transition model. So right now we're going into sociology from a macro and micro lens perspective. So I just wanted to briefly, review what sociology is, which is the study of society, human social interaction, and the rules and processes that bind and separate people, not only as individuals, but as members of associations, groups, and institutions. And many researchers in that field like to investigate these processes by a macrosociology perspective and a microsociology perspective. So for macrosociology, that focuses on the large scale perspective, looking at big phenomena that affect a big portion of the population, and also how this picture affects small groups. So some examples are looking at social structures, institutions, whole civilizations and populations, and more that I have here on the slide. And on the other hand, they also look at it on a microsociology perspective, focusing on the smaller scale perspective, looking at face-to-face interactions and how individual interactions would affect larger groups. So some examples of this are doctor-patient interactions, interactions within families, schools, and others similar to that. And so the first theory that is part of the macrosociology perspective is functionalism. And functionalism was developed by this man here, Emil. I'm not sure if I'm completely pronouncing that right, but his last name is Durkheim. And he looks at society as a whole and how institutions keep the society stable and functioning. And so he has several terms that he uses to define that are associated with his theory. And the way he defines institutions are structures that meet the needs of society. So examples he gives are education systems, financial institutions, marriage, laws, and more like that. And these institutions can have two functions, which are either manifest functions, which are the intended consequences of institutions, and also latent functions, which are the unintended consequences of institutions. He also uses the term social facts, which are ways of thinking and acting formed by society that existed before any one individual existed and also still will exist after any individual has passed away. So he considers these as unique objects that can't be influenced and also have a coercive effect over individuals that are only noticed once people resist. So the example he uses is the law. And then he also defines social dysfunction as a process that has an undesirable consequence and may reduce stability of the society. Another common term that's associated with functionalism, particularly, is social anomy, which is that the alienation that an individual feels when social norms and social bonds are weak. So he hypothesizes that without attachment to society, people will experience purposelessness and aimlessness, which is the social anomy feeling. Durkheim also postulated that small societies are held together by similarities, but this idea only works for small societies. On the other hand, he believed large societies become interdependent on one another as they specialize in different roles, which allows them to have a stable society. But one of the problems with functionalism that other theorists criticized Durkheim for was that it doesn't really focus on the individual perspective and also doesn't look at how conflicts can affect society. So this leads us to the conflict theory, which was developed by Marx, and it was the idea that society is made of institutions that are powerful, which creates inequalities. And he believed society evolves from feudalism to capitalism and finally to socialism. And the example that Marx points to when talking about capitalism happens to be 19th century Europe, which was broken down into the bourgeois class, which is the rich upper class, a minority of the population at that time, and the proletariat, which were considered the poor lower class, which was the majority of the population. And he believed that it was through class consciousness which led to people, noticing these inequalities. So them being aware of their place in a system of social classes, created that class struggle and that conflict between these classes. He also used the term thesis, which was considered the generally accepted existing state of society, and antithesis, which is the reaction and opposition to the thesis, which usually happens by the working class. And he also used the term synthesis, which was a compromise between both the thesis and the antithesis. Here we also have Max Weber, who contributed a little bit also to the conflict theory, but he also argued that several factors were moderating people's reactions to inequality. So some of these things that he mentioned were class, status, and power. So like how people actually reacted to this inequality were dependent on these different points. And one of the problems with conflict theory that other theorists criticized him about was the fact that it doesn't really focus on like the stability of the society, which I guess looking back is now why we have functionalism looking at that other side. Next, also part of macrosociology is the feminist theory, which focuses on pointing out the stratifications or inequalities due to institutions of society for women. And, this is through analyzing the social roles and experiences that women face in education, in family roles, and their workforce. And this was a theory that actually originated from conflict theory. So within the feminist theory, there are different focuses that it would be like subgroups of the feminist group focus on. So some of them focus on gender differences, which gender differences are socially constructed and they are created via processes of socialization. It's hypothesized that society creates and passes down norms, customs, and expectations for gender from generation to generation. The other aspect that has another focus is gender inequality, which is central to all behavior and organizations in society. It's also usually seen as under a patriarchal society where women's subordination is viewed as an inherent feature. And so here I define patriarchy, where it's when men constitute the governing body as heads of families and communities. The other focus is gender oppression, where it's found that women are not only unequal as men, but they're also oppressed, subordinated, and abused. And then there's also structural oppression, which is when women's oppression and inequality are due to capitalism, the patriarchy, and racism. And the last macrosociology theory is social constructionism, which is when people actively shape their reality through social interactions and agreement. It's something constructed but not inherent, and it was developed by Berger and Luckman. So they believe that, there was a social construct, which is the concept or practice that everyone in society agrees to treat something a certain way, regardless of its inherent value. So the example they give is money, which, without the value that society gives money, it's kind of just a piece of paper. And so like without that value, that money would be thought as useless in maybe another society. And then he also defines self as our identity being created by interactions with other people and also created by our reactions to other people and society. And he also defined a difference between weak social constructionism and strong social constructionism. So they proposed that social constructs are dependent on brute facts. So those are most fundamental facts and also institutional facts, which are created by social conventions that rely on other facts. So like the example with money, it depends on the value that we give this piece of paper. And this was contrasted with strong social constructionism, which is when the whole of reality is dependent on language and social habits, and all knowledge is a social construct and there are no brute facts. I guess one criticism towards this theory was that social constructionism doesn't quite address the natural phenomena that would probably be seen through like these brute facts. But because, for that strong social constructionism, it's not dependent on brute facts. That's why that was one of the criticism for this theory. And now we go into microsociology. So a theory that is common on the MCAT is symbolic interactionism, which is when it examines small-scale social interactions, focusing the attention on how shared meaning is established among individuals or small groups. This was developed by George Herbert Mead, and he talked about subjective meanings, which are when humans ascribe meanings to things, and also each individual acts towards those things based on that original ascribed meaning. He also defined language as allowing humans to generate meaning through interactions and also allowing humans to modify their meanings through to their thought processes. He was particularly interested in looking at symbols that are used by people and how they also contribute their values and beliefs to others through these different symbols. But he also noted that as time goes on, our meanings can also change based on our interactions with others. So that's that. And then the final microsociology theory for today is the rational choice or exchange theory. So the rational choice theory postulates that people are not only motivated by money, but they also do what's best to get the better value in a sense. So the idea is that everything people do is fundamentally rational to maximize that personal gain. The three main assumptions for this theory is that there is completeness, that means that every action can be ranked, and so you can find the value of it. Also that there's transitivity, since A is preferable to B and B is preferable to C. You may remember this from, I think, geometry before, but therefore A would be preferable to C. And then also that there is an independence of irrelevant alternatives. So if you have a fourth option from the A, B, and C that we mentioned before, it won't really change how the ranking was for the other three options. It would just add another place within this ranking system. So that's a rational choice theory. And then the exchange theory is that people calculate the costs and benefits of each action and choose the one with the best outcome for themselves. And this is mostly noticed through reward and punishment. So exchange theory is usually used to study family relationships, work relationships, partner selection, parenting, and also more. But the main thing is that people seek to rationally maximize their profits, and they want to continue doing behavior that results in more reward as opposed to punishment. And also there's the idea, because it relates with the costs and benefits, it also relates with supply and demand in terms that when a reward is more available, then people will also see that as being less valuable. And so, right, people want to maximize that benefit from the cost, but they also want to gain that maximum personal gain from the rational choice theory. So both of these are in a way related because it's a similar idea to maximize the good. And so from here, we're going to go into our first question. I'm going to give you guys 2 minutes to read it and answer it, and then we'll regroup after this. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask it in the chat or unmute at this time. Okay, if anyone wants to get their answers in the next like 10 seconds, I'm going to close the poll. And all these, answers are anonymous, so feel free to just, choose whatever you think, because we can go over it right after. Okay, so I'm going to end the poll now and share the results. So we have here 100% saying choice D. I'm very happy about that. So right here we have the answer is choice D. So the question asks, I'm just going to briefly go over it because I think most of you guys got it, but in case there are any questions about it. So the question asks, which of these is considered a research question viewed from a microsociology perspective? And so we want to look at something affecting a small scale perspective. So for choice A, it says, how does the patenting of seeds for various crops by large businesses cause a conflict between local farmers and the agribusiness? So we see here that the agribusiness is a really big, large scale type of business. So that already kind of would be like a macro sociology idea. And then with choice B, it says, how does the conflict between Republicans and Democrats in Congress affect the US? And like similar to choice A, the US as a whole, that's on a more macro sociology perspective, as opposed to looking at those small scale interactions between people. And then for choice C, it says, what impacts does having an alternate view of medicine have on the expectations of care provided? And so this is just care in general provided by the healthcare system. And so that is another like large scale thing, which is why choice D is the correct answer, because it mentions like what role do people who identify themselves as local community members play in their community? And so it's their interactions, their individual interactions with their community themselves, which is on a smaller scale view. So now we're going to also go into another question. I'm going to relaunch the poll and give you guys again another 2 minutes. Okay. Okay, so probably like 10 more seconds, and then we can go over this question. Okay, closing the poll now. So we have 100% saying choice A, which is also awesome because yes, this is because the answer is A. So you guys got it, like 100% of you guys got it, which is awesome. So just to briefly go over this one, it says in a nearby town, a student was speaking with a friend, and the friend believes that the reasons for the increasing number of strikes by workers in the nearby factory is due to the inequalities that workers have realized between them and upper management. Furthermore, that this inequality that the upper class maintains oppresses the lower class, which sociology theory best explains this friend's thought. So definitely because we're noticing here that it's regarding the inequalities between, in this case, workers and upper management. That one definitely relates to the conflict theory, which is all about like the inequalities between different classes. Functionalism more focuses on these what contributes to the stability of a society and is also on a macrosociology perspective. Symbolic interaction is more on a, both symbolic interaction and rational exchange theory are both on a minor, like a microsociology perspective that focuses on those like individual interactions that each person has with each other. So in this case, it's more of like the groups of these, you know, workers and the group of the upper management as opposed to like them interacting with each other, which is why choice A is the correct answer. And just so you know, for the most part, the MCAT will focus on the theories that I mentioned in this PowerPoint slide. If you see, I guess those are the ones that are most popularly tested on. So I would say really know these well and also really know the people who developed these theories, because sometimes they also might refer to them as like, or they might ask a question where they kind of give a situation and they ask, oh, you know, what would Durkheim, or what would the theory associated with Durkheim kind of lead to a conclusion for? And so then, you know, you would have to answer it that way sometimes. And then other times they just give you situations like this and try to ask you, you know, which theory best explains this. Okay, so if no one has any questions, because I think you all got this pretty down pat, we're going to go into demographics. So the different ways that society tends to be stratified. So the first one that I wanted to talk about was age. So the age stratification theory suggests that age is a way of regulating behavior of a generation. And so, you know, different generations have different behaviors. And so we're going to go into the main generations to know. I would say, so this first one, always on generation, which is anyone born 2010 and after, is something that I guess I didn't really learn about during the time when I was studying, but I guess this is a extra point to know, just in case it had, like they added a new term. So always on generation is anyone born 2010 and above, and Generation Z is anyone born between 1996 and 2010. A common acronym that, or a way to remember it, they sometimes have is the kids who love their Sony Xperia Z phones. So Generation Z for those Sony Xperia Z phones. For Generation Y, they're also known as millennials. They were born between 1981 and 1995. The way to remember it is that's us. I guess I'm not completely sure how. Personally, I kind of just remembered them by like each of the age stratifications on their own. But if that's us, like helps for the millennials, then that's a way to remember it. Generation X are those born between 1965 and 1980. So the way they refer to it is the 70s loved drugs, which is also known as ecstasy. So X for Generation X. The baby boomers were those born between 1946 and 1964, and are now considered a large population in the United States. And they should be around up to like the 60s by this time. And they grew up in the post-World War II periods and are currently leaving the workforce because of their age. Before that was the silent generation, which were those born between 1925 and 1945, which were born during the Great Depression. And so silent grandfather associated with that silent generation. And the GI or greatest generation are those born between 1901 and 1924, which are the oldest people alive today. And they were born during the first quarter of the 20th century. So acronym, or the way to remember it, is your great grandfather. So great grandfather, greatest generation. Your grandfather would probably be the oldest people in your family at this time. And then these are just like a infograph of, some different communication methods for each of the generations that are commonly, I guess, associated with it. But in terms of the MCAT, sometimes they might have like a discrete question that just asks about like, what generation would these type of individuals be? I would say is usually rare, but just something to keep in mind for age. And then the other common stratification method is through race and ethnicity. So race is a socially defined category based on physical differences between groups of people. The racial formation theory looks at social, economic, and political forces that result in racially constructed identities. So the most common races that I've looked up from the US Census this past year that they identify people by is like white or European American, Black or African American, Asian American, American Indian or Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian / Pacific Islander. And on the other hand, ethnicity is a socially defined category based on shared language, religion, nationality, history, and some other cultural factor as well. So ethnicity is a little less statistically defined than the racial groups above, and their definitions can also change over time. And a minority group, so within ethnicity, is a group that makes up less than half the total population and is treated differently due to some characteristic. This varies between each of the different groups. And the main ethnicity that the US Census also defines currently is Hispanic or Latino, and not Hispanic or Latino for the main groups. And then due to race and ethnicity, there are a lot of discrimination, prejudice, stereotypes, genocide, assimilation differences between all of these, different groups in different aspects of healthcare, education, wealth, income, and many more. Actually, we're going to be going more into discrimination, prejudice, and stereotypes in next week's lecture, where we kind of go a little deeper on how to differentiate between some of these terms, and also what are some common ones, but that's for next week. So this week is just recognizing these stratifications. And then another group that they separate individuals between are for immigration, so immigrants versus not. And immigrants tend to face very severe challenges when arriving to a new country. Many times people do want to help them, but are also wary of their different cultures and customs of immigrants, which ends up making it hard for many to communicate with them sometimes, and also get along with them. And immigration, so I guess one of the reasons for immigration is because it can alleviate labor shortages in other countries, but then at the same time it can also decrease the strain on their home economy that cannot quite support the large population. So it's a benefit for both the other country and their home country. But at the same time, immigrants can also be exploited by other countries too, depending on like how they treat these immigrants when they come to their new country. So that's I guess two sides to that. And also race and ethnicity, like we mentioned before, tend to be a cause for, biased policies and different expectations for people based on like their social interactions and socially defined laws in a sense. So one example here is in 1986 when the US passed the Immigration Reform and Control Act, which forbade hiring of illegal immigrants. But they extended the amnesty and legal status to illegal immigrants that were already in the US at that time. So there are also other policies that encourage families of immigrants to move or keep money in their local economy instead of having, immigrants send their families money from the new country that they're in. So these are just some challenges for migration. We will also probably go a little more into that next week in terms of like assimilation. And then the other separation, stratification in a population is by sex, gender, and also sexual orientation. So these terms are all interconnected and also important individually. So I'll be defining each of them in here, but they're also considered independent of each other. So sex is what most sociologists consider biological. Actually, probably also biologists, but anyway, the most common, ways to divide sex into is through male or female. So the XY sex chromosome for males and XX sex chromosomes for female. However, sex is also not considered binary. So there are different, chromosome combinations that could potentially lead to different, in a sense, like ways to characterize them biologically. And so that's why we say it's not binary at the moment. And because, there are these intersex people that have 1 or 3 plus so of, these sex chromosomes. So they tend to express different sex characteristics. And gender, on the other hand, is how one person would identify, how one person expresses their identity and also just like expresses themselves. And it's a social construction that is not quite fixed or an innate fact like sex, whereas biological, but instead varies across time and place. So the categories of gender are fluid, and it's also subject to social processes of, meaning making, and it's also not binary. Gender tends to also influence roles and norms, which can lead to, like stereotypes, prejudice, those kind of behavioral terms as mentioned before with race and ethnicity. And there are also like categories of cisgender, which is when both the biological sex and their an individual's gender identity is the same, and also transgender, where the biological sex and the gender identity of an individual don't match. So those are the groups within gender. And then sexual orientation is related to attraction and fornication. So this is not dependent on sex or gender. And this is because, you could potentially be attracted to any gender or no gender. And there are all these different combinations that there are. And, some examples are like, I guess the most common, not exactly most common, but I guess the original norm was that most people would be heterosexual, but then also there is also those that are homosexual, bisexual, queer, asexual, pansexual, also like a bunch more other terms that can be looked up on if you want to learn more. Yep. And then the other area that people also can be stratified by are income classes. So income class is separated by, the upper class, which is very wealthy businessmen and family wealth, middle class, which are professionals that tend to have better paying jobs, but are not quite up to that upper class level, and then lower class, which are manual work. They perform manual work, labor, and tend to be in low paying jobs. So the way that we kind of divide groups between like the rich, upper middle class, lower middle class, and poor and near poor is kind of dependent a little bit on like inflation and also like what the minimum amount is for supporting a family. But in 2019, for a family of 3, these were the values for how to separate people based on these groups. And so this is just like, I would suggest that probably best if you can look up the time period that's closest to, like the time period to separate all of these groups closest to when you're taking your exams, so that would be the most representative of like the population that most of the questions should be geared towards, if they are to talk about like stratifying people by income class. And then it's also important to know how class may affect individuals in society regarding healthcare, education, and opportunities, and more. So it tends to be the case that the upper class, as you go higher up in the class, actually, the healthcare treatment tends to be better. They also tend to have more opportunities for education, and also, other types of opportunities, whether it be like finding job, internship opportunities, or just, being able to do a bunch more things, as opposed to maybe mainly focusing on paying the bills and taking care of their family. So, and then the other aspect that can also stratify people is actually by geographic area. And so this is in terms of like the urban, suburban, or rural areas. So in urban areas considered cities or towns with over 1,000 people per square mile, and a city tends to also have over 50,000 people. Metropolises have over 500,000 people, so really packed areas. And a suburban area are residential communities that are located outside of city centers that are usually relatively homogeneous in terms of like the population of the people who live there. And it's usually between the amount of 100,000 to 250,000 people. And then rural areas are those that have less than 1,000 people per square mile. So the common ways to think of this as like a farm country or somewhere like Alaska, it has to have less than 25,000 residents in order to be considered rural. And another thing that, I guess, another term that the MCAT likes to test on a lot is with urbanization. So moving of people from these rural areas to the urban areas that began during the Industrial Revolution in order to find work or housing because of the technological advancements of like those urban areas, but that also led to jobs lost on farms. So people needed to go instead to these urban areas to find work and pay for their families. And so some pros of this is the wide variety of culture to get, different perspectives and understand all of this. They also, most people have more anonymity in a big city. There are also more job opportunities and more options or services for education, healthcare, and many other services for the general population. The cons tend to be that there is more crowding because of like the very small space, even though there are so many people packed in that area. And also, it's worth it to note that urban areas are host to more crimes and sources of inequality. So sometimes a question may come up where they ask like, oh, which of these areas is it most likely to, is there most likely to be a murder? Then out of those choices, you would most likely pick one that is in urban area or at least describes an urban area. Yes. And then continuing on, so on top of urbanization, there is suburbanation, which is the movement away from cities to get a larger home. And suburbs actually form their own economic centers and also become independent to the cities they border. Usually like that will be the time when commutes for the individuals in the suburb areas get longer because they're much farther away from the city than they were originally. And then another thing is gentrification, which is when, I guess it would most likely be like city officials or those responsible for the geographic areas that decide to revamp or improve and make old parts of the cities even better, or just make it better in general. This ends up attracting, I guess, more, or because of the work that they are doing in these cities, it tends to increase the property value of living there. And so it tends to be that more wealthy people enter those areas that are gentrified, and then it causes poorer people to be pushed out because they can't pay for that high property value. Also, slums are considered heavily populated urban informal settlements that are characterized by substandard housing that lack reliable sanitation services and a supply of clean water. So just very, in a sense, bad conditions for even though they are in this urban setting. And then a ghetto is considered an area where specific racial, ethnic, or religious minorities are concentrated. And this is usually due to social or economic inequities between that minority group. So this is just a demonstration of like an urban area, a suburban area, I would say, and then the rural areas here. And also another thing that's important to know is the demographic transition model. So this goes in different stages to kind of, it's to characterize like different countries and what stages of this like demographic transition they are in currently. So stage 1 is considered when that population has a high birth rate and also a high death rate. And so the reasons for high birth rate tend to be that they, have limited birth control because they're, usually in the earlier stages, I would say it's more of like a country that's still developing and trying to get the hang of things. So they have limited resources. And so one, limited birth control, which contributes to that high birth rate. And then also the high death rate because of disease and poor nutrition in that population. But both of these high values ends up leading to like the stable population. So it creates this kind of like pointy triangle at the top. And stage 2, so what happens in stage 2 is that the death rate decreases because of more food availability and also because of an improvement in health and sanitation. It still has that high birth rate, but because of this, death rate decrease, it causes population growth, which creates this triangle that's more like rounded out on the sides in a sense. And then stage 3 is when also with the death rate decreasing, there's also a birth rate that decreases because of their access to things like birth control, which leads to a slower population growth. So this rounded thing here. But although there is a slower population growth, the individuals in the population tend to have longer lives. So they can live to that higher, more people can live higher than that age of 65 here, you can see. And then for stage 4, this is when both birth rate and death rate are low, and it tends to be that more people have a focus on career. So like for women, they might not be reproducing as much as they did maybe in the earlier stages. And it tends to be that the population stabilizes. So you can see here, these are quite like, in a sense, like continuing on. So as this continues on a little bit, because of the lower birth rate, you know, there's a slightly less, like it goes in here on the sides of the amount of individuals being born. And then stage 5 is still like a speculation right now. But the speculation is based on the Malthusian theorem, which is that eventually populations will tend to run out of resources, and there will be global food shortage, and we won't be able to exactly maintain natural resources for everyone on the planet. And so that would cause like a certain threshold for the population to exist, but past that, probably there would be limits to even reaching a level past that threshold. So now we're gonna go into the first question for this session. I'm gonna give you guys 2 minutes again for this poll after I relaunch it. And then if anyone has any questions, I think I saw one in the chat over, so I'm going to address that in a second after, I think the poll is launched. Okay, the poll is launched. So just 2 minutes and we will regroup. Okay, wait. Okay. So we have 10 more seconds if anyone can get their last answers in, and I'm going to end the poll. Okay, so we have here 100% saying D. So I'm going to exit and continue. So you guys got it. The answer is D. And just quick run through. So the scientist wants to analyze the demographics of his subjects. And so which of these, which I mentioned early on throughout our presentations, all the different ways, could he use, or could she use in this demographics research? And as we spoke about, like age, the different generations, income level, the different classes, and also sexuality, different types of sexuality are all different ways that this researcher can definitely use for her demographics research. And we're going to go on for another question. And this should be the last question of tonight. So I will relaunch the poll and give another 2 minutes. If anyone has any questions, feel free to, put more in the chat or unmute, whatever you guys prefer. And also answer the question if you can. And if you're not completely sure, feel free to just do a guess as well, because all these answers are anonymous. Okay, so 10 more seconds if anyone wants to answer the poll, then we're going to go over this. Okay, so we have here 50% saying C and 50% saying D. So there is a little bit of a split here. So the answer here is C. Because of the split, I recognize that there is probably a little bit of a confusion. So let me see, in this, it says, the question says, in a graph, we see that a population has a decreasing birth rate and a decreasing death rate. What stage of the demographic transition is this population in? And so I think it's, first of all, great that all of you guys recognize that, both stage 3 and stage 4 are on those lower ends of both a birth rate and a death rate. So that's why for stage 1 and stage 2, those are incorrect answers. But for the difference between stage 3 and stage 4 is that stage 3 is like that point where the birth rates and death rates are still like decreasing. For stage 4, we already would have to know that the birth rate and death rate are considered low. So they have been maintained as being that low level for a while, as opposed to just like decreasing, which is why choice C, stage 3, is the correct answer here. Does anyone have any questions about this one? Okay, if not, thank you very much for attending tonight. I tried to keep it a little quicker. Just a reminder that we have office hours every Sunday from 8:30 to 10:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If any of you guys have questions about this topic or any of the past topics that we've done, or also even, just general MCAT questions, I'm going to try to get this PowerPoint recording out to you soon. So the PowerPoint I should be able to get to you by tonight, and then recording, I'll send the link as well. And if you don't find them in the next day or so on the GroupMe group, then feel free to send a reminder to me, and I will definitely send it out as soon as possible. So thank you guys so much for attending tonight. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them now. Oh, thank you, Saeed. Enjoy your Sunday as well. Enjoy your week.